The JSE remains on the back foot while global markets are mixed as investors continue to digest mixed corporate earnings reports in the US. Rand Swiss portfolio manager Viv Govender joins us now to take a look at the latest market moves at midday. Thank you very much, Viv, for your time. Let's start with what is making markets locally and globally move this afternoon.
Yes, a bit of a pullback locally. We saw the US last night end, basically flattish, and they've been like that for a couple of days. But I think right now the market's basically getting a lot more nervous. We're seeing our market down over 1%. We're seeing international markets like the Euro stocks down about 0.4% or so. A lot of uncertainty about the global economy right now is making things, a little bit negative.
Okay. The Rand was steady in early trade ahead of CPI and retail sales figures. What's the performance looking like now?
Yeah, look, the CPI number came in, like you mentioned, a little worse than expected, a little higher. The Rand right now is about 18.28. It's not great, but it's not basically, blowing out one way or the other. It's slightly, weaker today. But, if you compare the movements we saw, for instance, over the last week or so, at one point about 2 weeks or so ago, we were at 17.80. And now at like 18.30 almost, which is like a 50-cent move that is quite substantial. So like a 10-cent move today is not too much of an indication of the market reaction to the CPI number. Though, like I said, it is negative.
Okay, let's take a look in depth at that CPI number, ticking up 7.1%. Perhaps you can highlight the implications for you and I, but also the labor market in South Africa with unions consistently saying, well, it's not in line with salaries and salaries staying the same. Are we likely to see more strikes or industrial action as a result?
Most certainly. Look, inflation is up, and the thing about inflation being up is like what's really causing it to go higher are the worst things. In South Africa, because we're a poorer country, we spend a lot more on food than someone in the US does. So in the US, food is a tiny portion, of total expenditure. In South Africa, it's quite a big chunk of total expenditure, and it was up over about 14%. The food inflation in South Africa has gotten a bit out of control. I know there is moves by the Competition Commission to look into it, etc. But right now, food inflation is one of the bigger drivers for the increase in inflation we are seeing. And like I said, in South Africa, that's very bad news. In a place like the US, food inflation, yeah, it's a problem, but you're not going to get people going really hungry because of it. They might switch away from having more steak to maybe having a bit more ground beef or something or mince. In South Africa, people are switching out of proteins entirely. They are, having to cut down on calories. That's a really, really, terrible situation. And so, yeah, inflation is pretty bad. We saw UK inflation also come out a little worse than expected, though it is falling, but it's worse than expected. And it seems to be that outside of the US, you really don't see that really big drop down in inflation like you would want to see at the moment.
Agribusiness investor Zeda has released its financial results for the year. How have they performed?
Well, not too great. The share price right now is down a little bit, about just over 1%. But like I said, in the market, that's negative. It's not really out of line with the market at the moment. Very light trade, so it's not really indicating a very strong trend at the moment. The company did mention the fact that net asset value is coming down. Their agribusiness is not doing as great as they'd want to be doing. And, the tough economy is hurting them at the moment, which is to be expected. Look, I have a theory about these agricultural producers. We just got to get used to the fact that, there's more volatility in the agricultural sector than we are used to historically, just because things like weather patterns are changing, not to mention stuff like the Ukraine-Russia conflict that's also changing, fertilizer, production globally, etc.
Netflix has beat earnings estimates, but it's also cracking down hard on password sharing.
Yeah, a lot of turmoil happening right now in the streaming sector. I remember, we have Netflix, was the old, the first mover in the sector. Since being joined by companies like Disney, Amazon Prime, we have HBO. That I think actually is doing reasonably well. HBO. Luckily for Netflix, Disney has had some missteps recently. Amazon has had some missteps with things like the Lord of the Rings TV show, most expensive ever made, seems to be a flop. Disney has had a couple, big franchises not really take off, as well as ones like Star Wars and Marvel. So Netflix is getting a bit of a breather. But at the same time, they're facing quite a bit of competition, and therefore they have to, ensure that they choose to make profits, consistently and, finance their own kind of production, etc. And, the whole idea of, they had a tweet a while back, a few years ago, where they said basically, love is sharing your password. This was a tweet from Netflix. Now, however, you don't want to share your password, still they want everyone to pay for their own particular thing. And this crackdown, I think, is probably going to, discourage some subscribers, but I think longer term is probably what they have to do. They can't afford to be having people in multiple households in multiple cities, of one passport.
Viv, before we let you go, we're reporting on Marcus Jooste and Germany's move to get him there to account for what happened. MoneyWeb is reporting also that Murray Munro, the former accounting officer of Tongaat Hewlett, has been censured by the JSE and faces a R6 million fine for his role in misrepresenting the company's financials between 2011 and 2018. When we take a look at corporate crime, or what is called white-collar crime, in comparison to the corruptor-corruptee relationship, the outrage and the sanctions that are applied on the public sector, rather. Do we see that with the private sector?
No, South Africa is really, really out of sync with what the world looks like at the moment in terms of this, prosecuting white-collar crimes. You look at the U.S., you look at, there's cases of insider trading where guys get, decades-long, things, for really minor amounts. We look at Europe and, Marcus Jooste being, hauled before the judge in Europe, not in South Africa. Why? And even, for instance, the censure from the JSE. Look, they're doing what they can, and but they need to be backed up by jail time. The JSE doesn't have a prison system. The JSE doesn't have jailers. They can basically fine you and kick you out, but they can't do much more than that. There needs to be a criminal prosecution for these kind of crimes. For far too long, we have seen a number of these kind of things go unpunished. And quite frankly, without that kind of consequences coming through, there's not really an incentive to basically do something about this, or to basically obey the law as a corporate leader. Because, $6 million is a lot of money, but I mean, if you look over what the income they've gotten over time, it's could be multiples of that. Marcus Jooste, made, hundreds of millions, billions. And, if he was basically allowed to, or forced not to be a director anymore, never touch another company for the rest of his life and get a few million rand fine, he's set for life. The only thing that's going to basically make him upset is something like a prison sentence, which is, unfortunately, in South Africa doesn't seem to be happening, and we are relying on international bodies and international courts to basically do this for us.
Why is it not happening in South Africa?
I don't know. I mean, the case I'm amazed by that has not resulted in prosecutions. I mean, it's just outside this thing. It's a life epidemic stuff. The case where all the mentally disabled people were. There were cases that were horrific. I mean, people were eating toilet paper. How can you not go to jail if someone that you were basically taking care of starved to death and was eating toilet paper to feed themselves? Why is nobody after that big inquiry, nobody going to prison because of it? Those are the kind of things that are shocking in South Africa. And so, stand-up is obviously bad, but I mean, this is just a part of a larger pattern across the entire course of South Africa. Obviously we don't talk about Thabo Bester and that kind of stuff, but, in terms of white-collar crime in South Africa, it's not really being punished in the way it should be. And not just white-collar crime in the private sector, but the public sector as well. When's the last time somebody went to prison for multiple decades for corruption? Even when people died, like in this case here.
You mentioned the word corruption, and there's been mixed reaction to the appointment of a new board at SAA. Pray tell what you make of it.
Look, I mean, SAA I don't think is a necessary entity. I mean, we've seen that. We've seen when, they have their problems and they weren't basically flying as much as they are. The amount of money we spent on that doesn't make sense, in terms of the South African economy at the moment. Yes, you can have a national, carrier if you have the money of a place like France or the UK or something like say, Qatar or the UAE or something. But in South Africa, we really don't have this money to waste. It was shown that, quite frankly, the private sector was able to handle South Africa's transport needs when SAA went down a little bit. And I don't think we need to have a carrier that takes, billions every couple of years from South Africa's taxpayers. So, I don't think that's a necessary thing. And you're never going to have the same kind of competition, the same kind of efficiency you have in the private sector, in the public sector. And that's why the only things you should have in the public sector are the things that the public sector and only the public sector can provide. Things like, healthcare and for the public healthcare, public education, those kind of things. When there's a vibrant, air transport industry, I don't see a need to have a national carrier like SAA.
What's happening with Capitec, because the CEO has downplayed that 80% rise in impairment charges disclosed in the bank's latest annual results?
Look, the economy is tough. We know it's tough. We know it's getting tougher for people, especially on the lower end. Capitec, because of the pricing model and the entry to the market and the way they started marketing, etc., tends to skew towards the lower end, in terms of earners in South Africa. And there were reports that some people were borrowing in order to basically finance consumption because they were short of cash and so on. And this is what happens eventually when you have that kind of borrowing. When you're borrowing to finance consumption, eventually the servicing costs on that borrowing starts to eat into your income to high an extent. 80% is quite a big jump. It is very troubling, but it's an indicator of what's happening in the South African economy overall, and not just what Capitec is experiencing at the moment.
You mentioned one of the driving factors for inflation being food prices in South Africa. Yes, the Competition Commission doing work here and there, but it's nothing new. It's almost as if every year we're talking about the same thing. What then needs to happen? Because if we can point at one of the major contributing factors, which has devastating consequences, we are faced as a country with children who are looking at malnutrition impacting their growth trajectory. And so what needs to happen there that is not happening? Why are we talking about this every year?
Look, this is something that government needs to step in and help out. Food prices, especially for the very poor, needs to be to some extent, helped out by government. You can't. It's the most basic thing. Up there with like national defense, preventing your country from being invaded, making sure your people are fed, are like the two basic things the government should be doing. Making sure your children are not going hungry is something I think any functioning government should be doing. It's not like we don't have the wealth in the country to do something like that there, you know what I mean? Look, it's a lot of money. It's obviously going to be something, that will result in its own level of corruption or whatever. But quite frankly, if you have a child that's malnourished up to 5, 6, 7 and so on, it's going to decrease that child's brain power all the way till it's 70. The child will be not as smart as it would have been otherwise, not as tall, not as healthy. And that's something we'll be paying for 7, 8 decades. You know what I mean? So yes, this is something that I think that you can't just rely on the private sector to do. There needs to be some kind of plan to make sure there's feeding schemes for people that are very poor, making sure that, children get, the proper nutrition that they need. Nurses should be following up on making sure that children that are malnourished or below the levels that you'd be concerned about are getting some kind of supplementary kind of stuff coming through. Whether this comes in the form of a direct food aid or, an increase in the social grant. Yes, I know an increase in social grant doesn't sound great, especially in a country like South Africa where 2 times more people receive grants than basically pay income tax. But, there's things that are more important than fiscal stability. And I would think, feeding your children is one of those things.
The curious case of South Africa. Viv Govender, Randstad's portfolio manager. Thank you very much for your time.